So now we're going to move into kind of the heart of the matter about how we actually go about burning. First thing that we're going to talk about is yeah, we're going to do that first. First thing that we're going to talk about are fire line positions and burn day activities. So when you get out on a fire, we typically are going to have uh, very specific jobs for people to do, right? It's kind of run like a military operation or well organized machine where people have their job and they need to stick to it throughout the day. And so we're going to kind of go over each of those job duties that you may see on a prescribed fire. Now, some of these, you may not use on your fire, and some you may use them all. So we'll talk about positions, those positions' responsibilities, and then just talk about like what actually happens on the actual burn day. So, like I said, there's many different jobs. These are the most common jobs that you'll see on a prescribed burn, starting with the burn boss, crew boss, engine crew, igniters, ATV UTVs. We got hand crews, lookout spotters, weather monitors, tender managers, equipment managers. And so we'll go through kind of each one and discuss what exactly their positions entail. So, like I said, it's kind of set up like a military chain of command structure. So, at the very top, there's a burn boss, and that burn boss is the one that oversees everything. And then, since here in Nebraska and our grasslands and stuff, we typically run ring fire ignition, which we'll talk about later. We're gonna have two different crews, one going to the one side and the other going to the other side. So, we have what we call crew bosses. And then under each of those crew bosses on each side, we basically have, drivers, hose operators, igniters. I have a lead ATV, second patrol, and then a hand crew if we have those. So starting at the very top, this is going to be our burn boss. Burn boss is going to basically make sure that, everything that happens that day is done with a purpose. You're going to make sure they follow the burn plan. They're going to address all safety concerns on site. They're going to be familiar with the burn site and visit it beforehand. They get out and check and make sure that the fire breaks are what they're supposed to be. If there's any last minute touch ups that need to happen, they're going to basically continue, like, always take a look at the weather. So, as you're preparing for the burn, the morning of, the day of, as you're on the burn, they're going to get updates on the weather activity that's actually happening on the ground. And then another big thing is that they're going to brief the entire crew for the burn day and assign jobs before that burn actually happens. So they're going to place people in different, positions throughout the burn, basically divvy it up. So for burn bosses, it's best to be the only job on a burn, and that's because they typically jump from side to side, so from one crew to the next, basically checking out how things are going. They're going to be able to recognize and foresee any kind of fire behavior or weather changes, so they need to be kind of mobile and alert on those things. They need to like think quickly and act decisively. So if something needs to be done, they're the ones that should make it happen, and then also recognize any change in kind of crew behavior if they're seeing any problems with fatigue or anything like that. They also need to be able to give clear instructions and make sure they're understood. A lot of times when you're in the heat of the moment, you're doing burns on the radio, give very clear instructions to make sure that people know what they need to be doing. If you give an unclear instruction and the people on the burn kind of look around and go, what does he really want this to do? Then that could be a problem. So make sure you give that clear instruction. You also want to make sure that you're really familiar with the unit and the fuels that you're actually burning, just to have that experience. Another good one is to make sure you're familiar with crew names. I'm really terrible with names, but knowing your crew bosses' names and kind of the lead igniters' names, so when you're able to call out to somebody, you at least know their names, or you can call out their positions as well. So maybe it's like, lead igniter on the A team or something like that if you can't remember their name. This is also pretty important. The burn boss should be the only one that should call the volunteer fire department or 911 in the event of emergency. And that's just because, we don't want to prematurely call in the fire department if we can get things under control. People have an instance to, like, if something goes wrong in spot fire, their first instinct is to call the volunteer fire department right away. When in many instances, the crew on site is able to handle that. Another big part about being a burn boss is the burn boss is the one that allocates resources where needed. So, for instance, like if you're doing a burn and you had a plan where, this team was going to be working one side, and all of a sudden they're having problems with spot fires and stuff like that, they're the ones that are going to be able to take resources from maybe the other team and then allocate them to the other team to help out to prevent any problems. So they continually evaluate those resources and situations to make sure everything is going smoothly. So who is the boss? Someone who's really kind of patient. Sometimes things can be really frustrating, but you need to be able to be patient and calm. Obviously, if there's chaos happening, spot fires, any kind of conflict, you want to remain calm and understanding of any kind of conflict that happens on the fire line. Most of the times, we try to have it be the landowner or the person with the most burn experience. And many times, what we do is, one of our main goals of Pheasants Forever is to help train others on how to actually use prescribed fire. And so we'll actually take the time to try to help train people to become their own burn boss in the future. So a lot of times we have them ride with the burn boss and kind of co-burn boss with them. So again, going from that burn boss that kind of oversees the whole thing, now we move down to what we call a crew boss. And the crew boss is basically in charge of one flank of a burn, one flank side of the burn. And this is because we're typically using the ring fire technique, which is basically, going around flank and then doing the head fire. So this crew boss is basically in charge of the entire flank. So underneath them, they're going to be in charge of the lead igniter, the engine, the hose operator, the ATV, UTV patrols, and hand crews. Now, most times when I run my burns, I would like to have the crew boss be actually the lead igniter on a fire. That way, they're away from the equipment, the noisy pumpers and UTVs, ATVs, so they're able to use the radios. They're right near where typically spot fires or slop overs happen, and so they can and that way they can also control the pace of that flank. So they're the ones in control of that lead torch, that lead drip torch. So they're the ones that are actually controlling the pace, so they can start and stop whenever they want. Obviously, they need to have some of the same qualities as a burn boss. They also need to make sure they have good communication with the burn boss and the crew. Coordinating every move, making sure that resources are allocated on their flanks. So they're the ones saying, okay, hey, I need those UTVs, ATVs to make sure to go back to where we started on the burn to make sure there's no slop overs or any cow pies or anything that are smoldering on the fire line. Then under the crew boss, we typically have an engine crew. These are the ones that are going to be running our pumper units. Typically, you're going to have at least one driver and one hose operator at a minimum on these. A big thing with any kind of equipment on the fire line, make sure you keep your headlights on. The engine crew does need to be familiar with their pumper units and their trucks, know how to repair them, to start them, to operate them, how to tweak them a little bit if they need be. They obviously need to know how to refill the water at the water location. So they need to also know how to use the water tenders that are on site. They're the ones that are monitoring the water level and communicating it back to the crew boss, like saying, hey, crew boss, we've got, a quarter tank left. And the crew boss will basically be like, all right, cool. Well, let's stop igniting, or they're going to stop igniting, and then they're going to go fill up and then come back and then they'll continue igniting. So continuing to communicate with the crew boss on those conditions when they leave the refill the tank, obviously. And then they coordinate with that lead igniter, which I said typically I'd like to have as a crew boss to lay down that wet line. So they're going to be basically, right by that lead igniter, laying down that wet line. And then if need be, after maybe you get the line put in, They're also going to go back and patrol the fire line and then also respond to any kind of spot fires that the crew boss or burn boss needs them to respond to. So within the engine team, there's two different positions. One, engine driver, needs to be familiar with the unit and the landscape and terrain, right? If they, they're a flatlander and maybe they've never been up in the hills and don't know how to drive properly on those areas, just they need to be cautious of that. Know the capabilities. Can we get up this hill or, go through this area? It's a little mucky or something. They also need to be very alert, right? They're sitting inside the truck, so they're somewhat isolated from the rest of the crew, and so it's really hard for them to kind of zone out because a lot of times they're just sitting in the truck driving very slowly. So they need to remain alert while they're inside the cab. And this is really good for people with health concerns too, because they can stay up out of the smoke, and not be physically assertive on the line. Another thing that they really need to know about is how to fight fire, kind of like our wildland fire techniques, just in case we have an escape. So, they need to know to fight from the black and, to take their time and not just go, haul out over there and, get somebody injured. And then the second part of the team is that hose operator. So they're the ones that are going to be holding that hose and laying down wet line. So they're going to need to be also familiar with the pumper, able to troubleshoot it. They need to know things like, when the pump's, not being used, idle it down. Or, if you turn the water recirculation, shut it off, you need to open it back up if your hose isn't on. They need to know those things. They also need to know what the appropriate water usage is, right? If we can get away with laying down 10 gallons per minute on our wet line, um, then we need to be laying 10 gallons per minute on our wet line and not 40, because then we're going to run out of our water, that much sooner. So determining the appropriate water usage and distance as well. So you can see in this picture here, they're laying down a wet line right in the tire track, and then that lead igniter is lighting directly off of it. They do need to have somewhat of good hearing, be able to pay attention because they're going to be closer to the pump than normal. So they need to be able to hear. They also need to withstand some heat and smoke. Generally, the lead pumper doesn't get it too bad, but they also, if they have any escapes or anything like that or any patrol, they're going to be in some of that. And then also, again, familiar with the wildfire fighting techniques, which we'll discuss in a little while. So beyond that, again, the igniter or ignition crew. So again, typically crew bosses I like to have be the lead igniters, or they're the ones right next to the lead engine. But then also behind them, when we're putting our downwind black, which we'll talk about, these are the people that are going to be igniting the interior. So they're basically igniting the fire is planned in a safe manner in coordination with the crew boss and the burn boss. They need to be familiar with the ignition device and how it operates. Coordinate that wet lining with the crew boss. They need to communicate with burn boss on conditions. So a lot of times, the interior igniters are the ones that are typically kind of out of smoke and behind the flames a little bit, and so they can kind of feel those wind shift changes easier than the people that are actually on the fire line. They need to make sure that their drip torch is kind of continually refilled. Make sure they don't run out of fuel. There's nothing worse than running out of fuel. And then, of course, the big one here is never enter the burn unit without approval. And then, if you leave the burn unit, make sure you notify that you're out of the unit as well. So probably one of the most important parts on a fire is the ATV and UTV crews, and they're going to be communicating with their crew boss right on each flank as they're doing their job duties. They're going to maintain control of their vehicle at all times, lights on as always. I like to, when we're running ATVs and UTVs on the fire line, adhere to kind of basic traffic patterns. So, on the right side, going one direction, and then when you're coming back on the opposite direction. So basically, you don't run head on into anybody that's patrolling the fire line at the same time. Basic traffic laws. A lot of times, these ATV UTV crews will have sprayers in the back of them so they can put out little small spot fires. They could be equipped with like those farm sprayers that are upgraded to like the 5 gallon per minute pumpers, or they could have like that larger aluminum one that was in the back of that UTV, the high pressure one. They also may have kind of dual duty. A lot of times we'll put drip torches on these ATVs, UTVs, and have them go in and help out igniting where needed, especially when we're putting in that kind of downwind black. A big thing with ATVs and UTVs is make sure you clear debris from your skid plates. Be honest with you, I recommend that everybody just take their skid plates off their ATVs and UTVs. You're just asking for trouble with them on there. And be honest with you, it's very rarely that I come across anything that causes a problem. So make sure you have any kind of plenty of diesel or gas for it. Fill it up prior to going on the burn, but also make sure you have extra gas on hand in case you need it, because those ATV and UTV crews are constantly on the move. So they go through quite a bit of fuel and can pack on the miles. And so it's always good to have extra gas handy, at least stuck in a pumper truck or something like that to do. A lot of times we also have these crews are used to transport both equipment and personnel when needed. So, let's say we need some extra help on the north side. The UTV can go pick somebody up and bring them over, or go get drip torch fuel, stuff like that. Headlights on, headlights on. I'll keep repeating myself that. If you can get those little amber flashing lights on the pumpers, those are also pretty great. I think we're going to get some of those. And then familiar with their pump and how to troubleshoot it. Just make sure, a lot of times, sometimes we'll stick somebody on a UTV, ATV that's not theirs. And so just make sure that they know what kind of, how to operate the equipment. I don't know how many, there's 100 different ATVs out there, and it's always a crapshoot on whether you know how to operate that particular model or not, and sometimes you hop on one that's manual and you got to shift through the gears to get it started. So just being familiar with your equipment in general, always a good idea. So, like I said, I think the ATVs and UTVs are probably one of the most critical on a burn, because they're the ones that are patrolling, um, the fire line. So they're patrolling for any escapes and monitoring their burn progression. So typically, if we can, I like to have at least two ATVs on the line. The lead ATV is the one that kind of remains really close to the engine and the wet liner, just to make sure that the initial line that gets put in is solid and is there to quickly respond to any escapes. The secondary patrols, I want them going all the way back to the ignition point. So I want them basically going all the way back to the beginning, and I want them constantly traveling that line. Now, in most instances, we'll have multiple, we'll not only have a lead and secondary, but we may have like 3, 4, or 5 different ATVs patrolling a line, depending on how big the unit is or how complex it is. So always be on the lookout for other ATVs. You will be in and out of smoke a lot, so make sure you wear those goggles. Remember during the equipment, I talked about getting those goggles without the vents so you can get in that smoke a lot easier. If multiple people are patrolling, again, use that standard traffic rule. So one of the last positions that we have is basically the hand crew. If you have extra people and don't have enough equipment, ATVs or trucks, a lot of times we'll put a hand crew on there. And this hand crew basically is going to be doing the same thing while patrolling the fire line. Sometimes we may ask them to install a fire break or flip over cow pies, but they're going to be using kind of flappers or rakes, backpack sprayers, backpack blowers, different things. So the big thing is make sure, I try not to have too many people walking around on a burn just because there's so many vehicles, stuff happening. But just be familiar, those people that are actually on the hand crew, they also should be ready to jump in where needed. So, maybe you have them tied to an engine, and if somebody needs a break or something like that, you can swap out with them and grab a drip torch or something like that. And also, vehicles always have the right of way, just because you're going to be small um, in the smoke, and obviously it's going to be hard for them to see. So just watch out for vehicles and get out of their way as they're doing their job. So on a burn, everybody should act as kind of a lookout or a spotter, right? Their main job duty is to kind of watch for escapes. Um, but on some of the bigger burns, we actually have specific jobs of people that are used as lookout or spotters. And they would be stationed on a hill or high spot downwind of where we know those spot fires are potentially going to happen. And so while they're up there, they could act as a dual duty to maybe monitor the weather, report back to the burn boss. They're going to look at any kind of fire behavior changes that they're seeing. They obviously need to be in contact with that burn boss. They can also act as a relay in rough terrain. And they should also have some sort of suppression unit like a pumper or backpack blower to monitor and to put out any of those escapes. Weather monitor, this is usually a dual position, but if you got somebody that likes doing this, you could potentially put them on there. But we like to take readings every 30 minutes to an hour and write that down. So we record, the wind speed and direction, relative humidity, temperature, smoke, etc. Just jot those things down for future use. It's very good to have reference to in the future. Many times, like if we do a burn and we had a really good kill on some cedar trees, maybe we can go back and say, okay, well, it was around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. What was the weather conditions like? And you can kind of reference like, oh, well, yeah, it's because we had those kind of weather conditions, so you can maybe plan for that in the future. So water tenders on the site, if you got a couple water tenders, it's always good to have somebody kind of coordinate those, make sure that the pumps are running, that they're being filled up, coordinate those water resources. And this is good if there's an extra person on the site, it's great. But many times this is before the actual burn. We kind of the landowner is typically going to be one managing these things. Um, if you got these extra people working these pumps, you could always swap out with the engine crew if somebody needs to take a break as they fill up their pumper with gas. And it's kind of nice, especially if you're working a bigger burn. And the other thing, with these trailers that we've got, we've always kind of assigned a couple people within our PBAs as kind of equipment managers. They're the ones that kind of look after the equipment, check out the equipment, check it in, make sure all the equipment gets returned, making sure it's working. And if it's not working, they follow up with repairs and replacements. They keep good equipment and maintenance records and protocols within our organization. And these trailers, we've got forms on doing winterization and maintenance. We've got inventory sheets. All that stuff is in there that we kind of help keep up, and then we replace stuff as we go along too. So sometimes we need new gloves or shirts, or stuff gets worn out, or radios go bad. We replace those things within our PPAs. So again, just to kind of reiterate the positions on the fire, again, that burn boss at the top, 2 crew bosses normally. Sometimes you have even more crews. You could have 3 or 4 different crew bosses, depending on how many flanks and stuff that you're burning. And then underneath those, you've got the rest of those positions: igniters and drivers, hose operators, ATV patrols, hand crews. So it's a really good structure to move through. So as a member of, if you show up on a prescribed fire, there's a couple of different, responsibilities that you need to be aware of, right? Make sure you're within your physical comfort zone when you show up on a burn. If you're getting fatigued or or need to take a break, make sure you ask. Tell the burn boss if you got, any kind of conditions like asthma or diabetes or, heart condition or something, so we can plan around what position that you're actually going to be using or doing that day. Address any safety concerns that you have. If you see something before the burn or during the burn, don't be afraid to speak up. Like, say something. Is there something that concerns you? If there is, we'll take a look at it and address it if it is a concern. And so you always want to ask questions too. Don't be afraid to ask questions. One of the things I ask on my burns is before we start, is there anybody that doesn't know what they're supposed to be doing? And not many people really raise their hand at that point, but you can certainly. It gives them the opportunity to come up to you right after, like, "Hey, I'm kind of confused on what I'm supposed to be doing." So ask questions. Know who your burn boss is. What your responsibilities are, what type of equipment that you need. This is pretty big. Stick to your assignment until the end. Don't get up and walk away. Say you got to go calving and go home. Stick to the assignment. And if you're going to leave, tell somebody. Tell the burn boss, especially. Tell your crew boss that if you got to go, that's fine, but we just need to know about it and are not unexpected when we're looking for you. Because if you take off and we don't know where you're at, you could be out in the middle of the burn unit for all we know. But you might be sitting at home in the comfort of your own chair. Expect to put in extra time after the burn, especially mopping up and patrolling edges. And make sure to communicate and communicate and communicate. So let's talk about burn day activities. So what actually happens on burn day? Like, what's kind of the process? Once you get there, you get your position. All these different things kind of need to happen. So, first thing early in the morning, when I get up, first thing I'll do is check that weather forecast. Make sure it's still within prescription, and I kind of make a final decision to whether we're going to burn for the day or not burn. And then I typically I'll typically send out, a final email saying, "Hey, we're good to go." The next thing you'll want to do is call the fire chief. If they want you to, let them know that you're going to be burning. In some cases, you may need to pick up a burn permit the morning of to do that. And then prior to, we always call dispatch and call the neighbors prior to burning, let them know when we're going to be burning so they can take appropriate measures if need be. And then we're going to inspect all of our equipment on hand. So once we all gather and meet up at the site, we typically find a nice little staging area near the burn site. We're going to put all the crew together at the burn unit. We're going to load up all of our equipment, get it all tested, make sure everything's working. We're actually going to spray our nozzles and fire up the pumps full speed. Just make sure everything's working properly, that, pull cords don't come off, things of that nature. You're going to get your drip torches filled. You're going to get your gas tanks filled up, just all that general equipment stuff. You're going to get your goggles and your gloves, any equipment that you need loaded up on your trucks or ATVs. And then what will happen is that the burn boss will gather everybody around and give a crew briefing and then assign responsibilities. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we conduct a test burn, and then we burn, and then we mop it up. It's kind of usually how the day goes. And we'll talk a little bit about specifics. So in the crew briefing, we talk a lot about just general aspects of the burn, right? We do introductions if there's new people. We talk about what's our expected weather, fire behavior, give crew assignments, any hazards. We basically go through all that stuff. So we'll talk about this map, what size, what is the burn unit, what type of fire breaks, how big are the fire breaks, what are the concerns with fire breaks, what wind direction we are expecting or needing for the day, where water resources are located, We're going to talk about what's in the surrounding landscape. So let's say if our fire does get out, what kind of fuel are we going to be looking at trying to put out? We're going to talk about where we're going to actually ignite our burn, is it going to be up in the northeast corner or wherever? Talk about how you're going to do the burn. Are you going to do a ring fire technique? Where are we going to end this burn? What's our endpoint? Talk about hazardous areas, not only outside the burn unit, but inside the burn unit. So we're going to be looking at things like, where are the holes at? Are there any old dump sites? Are there any wet spots? Things of that nature. We're also going to talk about crew patterns. So we're going to talk about, how we're going to do that ring fire technique and, where those crews are going to go. And then, of course, you want to talk about the different roadways, what kind of conditions they may or may not be in. Talk about fences, where the gates or areas of letdown are located. We're going to address any kind of hazards throughout the day, whether power lines or pipelines. Funny, the other day I got a text from one of the where we were burning on Tuesday, and the gentleman texted me asking me if we should bring up the fact that it's an old bomb range and there could be unexploded ordnance out there. So stuff like that obviously could be, addressed during that crew briefing time. Talk about culverts. We've had scenarios where we've had fires where we're burning off roads, and there was fuel that got into those culverts, and the fire went through the culvert over onto the other side and started a fire on the other side of the road. So those things all can be addressed during that crew briefing. And then also talk about any kind of jackpot fuels, trees, logs, brush piles, blowing embers, things of that nature within the unit as well. Again, here's one a couple years ago. One of our trucks found an unfortunate hole in it. The pumper fell in, had to use the UTV to pull it out. We could have easily avoided that by having maybe a crew member walk in front of the engine just to check it out before they kept going. Check out any hazardous sites. Is there old gas cans or propane tanks? We've had a couple scenarios where we ran into old farm dump sites that had old oil cans to put residual oil in them and stuff. And any fence lines, every vehicle should have sort of wire cutters or fencing pliers to cut fence if need be. And then, of course, once we get done with that crew briefing, we're going to do a test fire. And one of the biggest things about test fires for me is we're checking a little bit about fire and smoke behavior, about what's expected. But the thing is that that's going to change constantly throughout the day. So if we start at 9 o'clock in the morning, that small little test fire is going to be different than it will be at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But it does give you a very good chance and opportunity to make sure that your nozzle width, your drip torch fuel is regulated properly. Look at how big the flame length is on when you put down the initial black line to make sure that your wet line is large enough. And then the final thing that the test fire really does for me is just kind of calms everybody down. There's fire on the ground. It's natural human instinct, I think, to look at fire and be like, oh man, what's going on? So it gives a chance for everybody to see that, this is totally fine. It's under control. Things are looking good. And at that point, once things look good, you got everything inspected, and that's when you can start with a fire. Then again, documenting weather throughout the day is really important. And I got a video here that I'll show you kind of a reason why, documenting the weather or just getting the weather. So this next clip will basically show you a burn that we were expecting the weather to do one thing, and it kind of did the exact opposite of what we were thinking.
Pete, for Jim and Brian, I got a weather update for you. We got 24% relative humidity, 3 to 4 mile an hour winds out of the north and south of the north.
So you can see on that video that our fire behavior started to decrease because our wind or our fire weather forecast started changing. We had more cloud cover come in, and we lost a lot of humidity. Humidity went up. So those are good things to know. But most of the time, it's the opposite, right? So most of the time, our weather changes that happen become more dramatic, like as we go throughout the day, right? That between 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the evening, that's usually when bad stuff can happen. That's when our RH is really starting to drop really low. That's when our temperature is increasing or is going to be at the highest. But then other things to look at is, are there any shifting winds? Shifting winds could be a sign that maybe some kind of front's going to drop in on us and have cause us any kind of problem. So those are things to kind of look at afterward. The other thing that this is really extremely rare, I don't think I've ever seen it yet, but fire can create its own weather. So if you get like a large enough smoke plume, it actually gets in the atmosphere and create these thunderstorm downbursts and cause lightning. I think there's got to be some kind of factor involved in how these kind of form, and I think they're probably more suited to like fires during the middle of the summer. I don't think the atmosphere is quite conducive about it in the springtime when it's a little bit drier out. But I think they're working on a paper about this currently right now. So, but something to be considered, concerned about. But again, on any prescribed fire, most of the prescribed 99% of prescribed fires in Nebraska, this probably will not ever happen.